The rain came down on Boston the way it always did in late November. Slow, gray, patient. The kind of rain that has nowhere better to be, and so it stays and stays and stays. It tapped against the windows of the city bus, slid down in long, crooked rivers, and turned the streetlights into smeared halos of gold. Inside the bus, a young woman sat near the back. Her shoulders drawn in her hands, folded around a small leather notebook in her lap. She held it the way a soldier might hold a letter from home. Her name was Eleanor Hawthorne. Most people called her Ellie. She was 26 years old and she worked at the Boston Public Library on Boylston Street. She wore a wool coat that was older than she was, a coat that had once belonged to her father, and before him she suspected to someone else. The cuffs were frayed. The buttons did not quite match, but it had survived 2 New England winters on her shoulders, and that, she thought, was more than most things could say. The bus rolled past Copley Square. Ellie did not look out. She stared at the notebook in her hands. The cover was soft from years of handling. The leather had darkened where her grandfather's thumb used to rest. She could still see the faint half-moon mark his nail had left behind after decades of opening it the same way in the same place with the same patient hands. Walter Hawthorne, 89 years old, gone 3 weeks now. She closed her eyes and let the bus carry her toward the lawyer's office in the financial district, where the rest of the family would be waiting. The vultures, her grandfather had called them once in a moment of unguarded honesty over a cup of black coffee in his workshop. The vultures don't show up for the man, kiddo. They show up for the carcass. She had laughed when he said it. He had not. The bus hissed to a stop. Ellie stepped out into the rain. The memory came to her then, the way memories do when a person needs them most. She was 8 years old. Beacon Hill, late afternoon in October. The kind of light that turns everything. The color of old whiskey. She was sitting on her grandfather's lap in his workshop, and the air smelled the way her childhood would always smell to her. Cherry pipe tobacco, lemon oil, sawdust, and something warm underneath all of it that she could never name. Walter held a small piece of mahogany in one hand. He turned it slowly under the lamp. "Look at the grain, kiddo," he said. His voice was deep and a little rough. The voice of a man who had spent 8 decades using it carefully. "See how the lines run? That's the tree's whole life right there. Every dry summer, every hard winter. The tree remembers everything. Wood doesn't lie." She had nodded the way children nod when they don't fully understand but want to. He had set the wood down then and reached into the drawer of his workbench. He pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a medal, bronze, faded, attached to a worn ribbon. He laid it in her small palm. "You know what this is?" She had shaken her head. "Korea, 1953. Got it the year before they shipped me home." He looked at it for a long moment. "Not because I was brave, Ellie. I want you to remember that. I got it because I finished what I started. That's all. That's the whole story." He had closed her fingers gently over the metal. "A man finishes what he starts, kiddo. And so does a Hawthorne woman. Don't ever let anybody tell you different." She had been 8 years old. She had not understood what he meant, but she had felt the weight of the metal in her hand, and she had felt the weight of his words, and somehow she had known to keep both. The rain pulled her back to the present. She was standing in front of the building, 40 floors of glass and steel rising into the gray sky. The brass plate by the door read, "Sullivan and Associates Attorneys at Law." She pushed through the revolving door and stepped into a lobby that smelled of cold marble and money. The elevator carried her up in silence. She watched her own reflection in the polished doors, A small woman in a borrowed coat, her hair pulled back, her face pale from the cold. She did not look like a woman about to inherit anything. That was fine. She had not come here to inherit anything. She had come because her grandfather had asked her to in a letter she had received a week before he died. A short letter. Just a few lines. Be there, kiddo. Whatever they say, whatever they do, be there. You'll know what to do when the time comes. The conference room was on the 32nd floor. The door opened into a long mahogany-paneled chamber with a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. The rain ran down the glass in steady sheets. Below the city was a smear of taillights and umbrellas. They were already there. Aunt Cordelia Hawthorne Pierce sat near the head of the table. She was 63 and looked 45 the way only money can make a woman look. She wore a black Chanel suit, a diamond brooch the size of $50 at her collar. Her perfume reached Ellie before her eyes did. Something French, something expensive, something that smelled like a department store at Christmas. She did not look up when Ellie entered. She was examining her own reflection in the screen of her phone. Beside her sat her son, Sterling Pierce, 28 years old. He was wearing sunglasses indoors. He always wore sunglasses indoors. Sterling lived on his mother's allowance and the dwindling patience of 3 different ex-girlfriends. He had not held a job in 4 years and considered this an achievement. He was scrolling through his phone with the expression of a man being terribly inconvenienced by the death of his grandfather, and across from them at the far side of the table sat Uncle Bennett Hawthorne. Bennett was the dangerous one. Ellie had always known this. He was 58, lean as a hunting dog, his silver hair cut short. His suit a dark charcoal, so well tailored it seemed painted onto him. He was a corporate liquidator by trade, which was a polite way of saying he made his living by carving up companies the way a butcher carves up a pig. Quickly, efficiently, without sentiment. He had spent the last decade trying to have his own father declared mentally incompetent. He had failed. Walter had outlived him in court 4 times. And now Walter had outlived him in death too in his own way. And Bennett did not yet know how completely. Bennett looked up when Ellie walked in. His eyes were the same color as his father's had been, pale gray like wet stone. But where Walter's eyes had been kind, Bennett's were calculating. He gave her a small, polite smile that did not reach any other part of his face. "Eleanor," he said, "Uncle Bennett." She took the seat at the far end of the table, the seat farthest from all of them. She set the leather notebook in front of her. She folded her hands. She waited. The lawyer entered a moment later. Atticus Sullivan was 72 years old. He had been Walter Hawthorne's attorney for 41 years. He moved slowly the way old lawyers do, as if every step were a final argument. He carried a single manila folder. He set it down on the table, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked around the room. "Thank you all for coming. Let's get on with it, Atticus." Cordelia did not look up from her phone. "There's traffic back to Greenwich, and I'd rather not be sitting in it at nightfall." Sullivan looked at her over the rim of his glasses for a long, quiet second. Then he opened the folder. "Your father was very specific about how he wanted this read. He asked that I read it exactly as written. No editorial, no interruption. I would ask you all to honor that. Just read it, Atticus." Bennett's voice was smooth. "We're all adults here." Sullivan cleared his throat. "I, Walter James Hawthorne, being of sound mind and deeply disappointed spirit, do hereby divide what remains of my earthly possessions among those who have outlived me." The room went still. Even Sterling looked up from his phone. Sullivan continued. "To my daughter, Cordelia Hawthorne Pierce, I leave the family estate in Newport, Rhode Island, along with all furnishings therein valued at approximately $4.2 million. May the empty rooms give you all the silence you spent your whole life chasing. Cordelia's mouth tightened, but the figure cut through the insult. 4.2 million. She glanced sideways at her brother, and the corner of her lip lifted. To my son, Bennett Hawthorne, I leave the entirety of my domestic investment portfolio managed by Vanguard, totaling $6.8 million. You always measured a man by the size of his accounts, Bennett. Now you finally have one to match the size of your ambition. Bennett did not move. He did not blink. He simply steepled his fingers the way a man does when he is being told the price of a thing he already intends to buy. To my grandson, Sterling Pierce, I leave my collection of restored vintage automobiles housed in the secondary garage on the Newport property. May you drive them with more care than you have driven the rest of your life. Sterling actually smiled. He had not heard the second half of the sentence. The Shelby is finally mine, he said to no one. Sweet. Sullivan did not look up. He turned the page, and then his voice softened. Just slightly. So slightly that only Ellie noticed because she had been listening for it. And finally, to my granddaughter, Eleanor Hawthorne, the only one of you who ever came to see me without first checking my bank balance, the only one who loved the dust of my workshop more than the shine of my checkbook. The room had gone very, very still now. Cordelia's eyes lifted from her phone for the first time. Bennett leaned forward, slowly, like a man who has heard a sound he was not expecting and is calculating its source. Even Sterling put his phone face down on the table. A trust fund. They were all thinking it. An offshore account. A hidden brokerage. He had given the rest of them millions. What was he about to give? The favorite Sullivan took a breath. To Eleanor, I leave the 19th century mahogany Davenport writing desk, currently located in the corner of my study. The silence held for one full second. Then Cordelia laughed. It was a hard, sharp laugh. The kind of laugh that has glass in it. She brought one manicured hand to her chest and laughed again. A desk. He left her a desk. Bennett's shoulders relaxed. The smile that had been waiting on his face finally arrived. It was a cold thing. It was almost relieved. All those weekends, he said softly. All those tea visits. All those little stories you sat through Eleanor. And he left you a piece of furniture the estate liquidators were going to throw in a dumpster. It's not junk, Ellie said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. Oh, sweetheart. Cordelia's pity was a thick, rich syrup, the worst thing Ellie had ever tasted. Of course it's not junk. It's a beautiful piece of firewood. You can use it to sort your overdue notices at that sad little library of yours. Sterling laughed at that. He laughed too loud and too long the way a young man laughs when he wants his mother to know he is on her side. Want me to strap it to the roof of the Shelby for you, B.L., he said. I'd hate to scratch the paint, though. Ellie looked at him. She did not laugh. She did not flinch. She turned to the lawyer. Is that all, Mr. Sullivan? That is the entirety of the distribution, Miss Hawthorne. Sullivan's voice had gone very gentle. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a soldier. Going into a battle the man knows is already won. The desk will be delivered to your residence by the end of the week, courtesy of the estate. Thank you. She stood. She picked up her grandfather's notebook. She did not look at Cordelia. She did not look at Bennett. She did not look at Sterling. She walked out of the room. Behind her, she heard Cordelia's laughter start up again, low and amused, like the purr of a cat that has just eaten something small. The elevator carried her down in silence. She watched her reflection in the brass doors. Her hands were not shaking. Her breath was steady. She was almost surprised by this. She had spent the entire bus ride here preparing for the possibility that she would cry in front of them. She had rehearsed how she would not. She did not need to. She did not feel like crying. She felt like standing very still in the middle of a quiet room. Outside, the rain had thinned to a fine, cold mist. She crossed Boston Common with her hands deep in the pockets of her father's coat. The bare elm trees rose around her like the ribs of a ship. A few late joggers passed her in the gray. A man in a wheelchair fed pigeons by the fountain. She walked slowly the way she had walked as a child, beside her grandfather when he had taken her on Sunday afternoons to feed the ducks at the public garden. And he had held her small hand in his large one, and he had told her stories about Boston before she was born. She thought as she walked to the last time she had visited her grandfather. It had been a Sunday in early October, 6 weeks before he died. She had brought him a paper bag of his favorite shortbread from a bakery in the North End. He had been sitting at the desk. Her desk now, she supposed. He had been sketching a clock movement on a piece of graph paper. The window had been open. The smell of falling leaves had been coming in. He had looked up when she walked in. His eyes had been clear and tired and pleased. "There she is," he had said. "There's my girl." She had kissed the top of his head. His hair had smelled of pipe smoke and old soap. "Brought you the shortbread, Grandpa?" "Sit down, kiddo, sit down. Talk to an old man." She had sat across from him. He had pushed the sketch aside. He had looked at her for a long, long moment. "Ellie, listen. I want you to remember something." "All right. Tears are private. Don't ever give them away to people who didn't earn them." She had laughed a little. "Where did that come from, Grandpa?" "Just remember it, kiddo. Just remember it." She had remembered it. She remembered it now, walking across Boston Common in the cold, and she understood for the first time what he had been doing on that Sunday afternoon. He had been arming her. He had known what was coming. He had been packing her cartridges one by one and handing them to her and trusting her to know when to load them. She walked home. 4 days later, the desk arrived. It came on a Wednesday. The two movers were big men with thick arms and tired faces, and they spent a full 10 minutes wedging the thing through the narrow doorway of her third-floor walk-up in Somerville. The staircase had not been built for 19th century furniture. The desk groaned. The movers groaned. The walls picked up a few new scuff marks. "Where do you want it, lady?" one of them grunted. "By the window, please, right there." She moved a wilted houseplant out of the way. The men set the desk down with a final heavy exhale, and one of them stepped back and wiped his forehead. "Heavy son of a gun. What is that Victorian Davenport?" Ellie said. "1870s, maybe 1880s. My grandfather thought it was English." The mover whistled low. "A lot of desk for a small apartment." "It is." She tipped them. They left. She closed the door behind them, and then she stood alone in her living room and she looked at the desk. It was enormous. It dominated the small space the way a piano dominates a parlor. Dark mahogany, polished dull by 150 years of hands. 8 side drawers, 4 down each side. A slanted writing surface set into the top with a worn leather inlay, the leather cracked at the edges and curled like an old map. Above the writing surface, a raised back panel, intricately carved with twisting ivy and small clusters of berries. The brass handles on the drawers had gone green with age. There were deep gouges along the legs, scars from decades of being dragged across hardwood floors. It was not a beautiful piece of furniture, not in the way Cordelia would have used the word. It was a beautiful piece of furniture in the way her grandfather would have used the word. which meant it had been made slowly by hands that cared out of materials that would outlive everyone in the room. She walked over to it. She pressed her palm flat against the writing surface. She closed her eyes. It still smelled like him. Cherry pipe tobacco, lemon oil, old paper, a faint, almost imperceptible note of brass polish, the kind he had always used on the small tools in his workshop. She breathed it in slowly, and for one impossible second, it was as if he were standing right behind her, one weathered hand on her shoulder, the way he had stood behind her 100 times when she was a child, watching her draw at his kitchen table. "Okay, Grandpa," she whispered to the empty room. "Let's get you cleaned up." She spent the rest of the day on her hands and knees. She had bought the supplies the day before: specialized wood soap, brass polish, a pile of microfiber cloths, a small bottle of lemon oil, the same brand he had used. She put on an old sweatshirt. She tied her hair back. She made a pot of coffee and put on a record her grandfather had loved, an old Tony Bennett album with a scratch in the second song, and she got to work. She started with the writing surface. She wiped away the dust of months. She emptied the small inkwell of its dried, crusted residue. She found 2 rusted paper clips in the top drawer, a yellowed receipt from a hardware store on Cambridge Street, dated 1986, and a pencil stub worn down to almost nothing. She held the receipt for a long time. Then she set it carefully aside on the windowsill, the way a person sets aside a relic. She moved to the drawers. She pulled them out one by one. She wiped them. She polished the brass handles until they began to glow again, slowly. Reluctantly, the way old things do when you remind them they were once new. She sang along very softly to the Tony Bennett record. Her grandmother had loved that record too. Her grandmother had been gone for 15 years now. The 2 of them had used to dance to it in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. And Ellie remembered when she was very small, sitting at the bottom of the stairs in her pajamas, listening to them laugh. Outside, the November light began to fail. The radiator clanked. The apartment grew warm. She made another pot of coffee. It was nearly 7 in the evening when she got to the bottom right drawer. The last one. It stuck. She frowned. She pulled gently at the brass handle. The drawer slid out 3 inches and then stopped as if something were holding it from behind. She wiggled it. She pulled harder. The ancient wood groaned in protest. She knelt down on the hardwood floor and grabbed the small flashlight she kept in the kitchen drawer. She clicked it on. She lay on her side on the rug and aimed the beam into the dark cavity behind the drawer. There was something in there. A small wedge-shaped piece of wood lodged against the wooden runner at the very back of the cavity. It looked at first like a splinter, like a piece of the back panel had broken off and gotten jammed. She reached her arm in, her shoulder pressed against the dusty inside of the desk. Her fingers brushed the wedge. It did not move. She pressed harder. Her fingers slipped. She tried again. She got her thumb under it. She pushed. Click. It was not a splinter. The sound was sharp and metallic and loud in the small apartment. It echoed inside the hollow belly of the desk like the click of a rifle bolt being drawn back. Ellie froze. Her arm was still inside the cavity. Her cheek was still pressed against the cold mahogany. And then, from above her came a sound she would remember for the rest of her life. A soft, slow whirring. The sound of old gears that had been waiting for 150 years to turn again, finally turning. Patient, mechanical, unrushed. She pulled her arm out and sat up. The carved back panel of the desk, the one with the intricate ivy and the small clusters of carved berries, was sliding downward, smoothly, steadily, as if a hand inside the wood were lowering it. She watched it descend frozen on her knees. her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The panel disappeared into the body of the desk with one final delicate click. Where solid carved mahogany had been a moment ago, there was now a rectangular cavity, about the size of a large shoebox, lined in dark velvet, hidden from the world for who knew how many decades. Ellie did not move. She could not. Her grandfather had loved mechanical things, clockwork, puzzles, hidden compartments. He had been the kind of man who, when he built a wooden box for her 10th birthday, had built 3 secret drawers into it that she had only discovered one at a time over the course of 2 years. He had laughed every time she found a new one. He had said every time the same thing. The best gifts, kiddo, are the ones you have to earn. She remembered that now. She rose slowly to her feet. Her legs were unsteady. She wiped her hands on her jeans as if she were about to greet a stranger. She crossed to the desk. She looked into the hidden alcove. There were 3 things inside. The first was a small velvet pouch drawn closed with a silk cord. The pouch was heavier than its size suggested, and when she lifted it, she felt the weight shift in her hand the way only one kind of metal shifts. The second was a thick bundle wrapped in oiled canvas cloth tied with a strip of leather. Heavy. Solid. A book of some kind, she thought. The third was a thick manila envelope sealed with a circle of red wax. The wax bore the impression of her grandfather's signet ring, the one he had worn on his little finger for as long as she had been alive. She could see the small WH pressed into the center of it. She carried all 3 items to the writing surface and laid them down carefully, as if they might break. The Tony Bennett record had ended. The apartment was very quiet. Somewhere on the floor below, a radiator hissed. Somewhere outside on Somerville Avenue, a car passed with its tires whispering on wet pavement. She opened the velvet pouch first. The gold caught the light from her overhead lamp and threw it back at her like a small warm sun. 4 bars, each one heavy as a brick of regret. She lifted one. The Swiss bank insignia was stamped into the metal in clean, deep relief along with a serial number and a weight. She held it in her palm. She had never held real gold before. She had not realized it would feel almost alive. Cold and dense and alive. "Oh my God," she said softly. To no one. To him. To both. She set the bar down. She moved to the canvas bundle. She untied the leather cord. She unfolded the oiled cloth slowly the way you unwrap a body. Inside was a ledger. Old. Bound in cracked black leather. The spine was reinforced with brass. The corners were worn smooth. A faint rectangle on the front cover, where a nameplate had once been but had long since been removed. She opened it. The pages were filled end to end with her grandfather's handwriting. That neat, slanted, almost architectural handwriting she had grown up watching. Columns of numbers, dates, names, notations in the margins. She turned a page, another. The earliest entries went back to 1978. The most recent were from earlier this year. She turned to a random page near the middle. And then her stomach dropped. She read a name, Bennett Hawthorne. She read another, Cordelia Hawthorne Pierce. She read a phrase written in the margin in her grandfather's careful hand. Cayman, Argus Holdings, undisclosed. She read another, forged signature, Tribeca Notary, bribed 3,000 cash. She closed the ledger. She did not breathe for a long moment. Then she looked at the manila envelope. Her hands were shaking now. But it was not the shake of fear. It was the shake of something else. Something colder. Something cleaner. The shake of a person who has just opened a door and seen on the other side the outline of a much larger room than she had been led to believe existed. She broke the wax seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy parchment folded once. She unfolded it. Her grandfather's handwriting, even and steady, the writing of a man who had taken his time. She began to read. My dearest Ellie, if you are reading this, it means you have remembered what I taught you about looking beneath the surface. And it means the vultures have taken the bait. For years, I watched my own children quietly dismantle the legacy I built. I watched them lie. I watched them steal. I watched them cover their tracks and tell themselves they had earned it. I could have turned them in long ago. I chose not to. I told myself it was to protect the family name. I think now that it was because I was ashamed, kiddo. Ashamed that I had raised a thief and a liar. A father pays for his children's sins in the quiet of his own chest, and I have been paying for a long time. But I could not let them win in the end. The millions I left them today in the public will, that is the surface money, the visible money, the taxed money, the bait, the true wealth of the Hawthorne family, the antique equity, the bearer instruments. The funds I have moved quietly out of their reach over the last 5 years is yours. In this envelope, you will find a key and a series of account numbers for the Geneva Federal Bank. The accounts hold approximately $42 million. It is fully legal. It is fully documented. It is untraceable by Bennett. It is yours free and clear. The gold in the desk is for travel and immediate expenses. Use it as you need. But more importantly, kiddo, you now hold the ledger. You hold 32 years of their fraud, their evasion, their forgery, their theft. They believe they have buried me. They believe they have discarded you. They believe they have won. You will know what to do. Burn the ledger and live a quiet life with your fortune, if that is what you choose. I will be proud of you either way, or show them what kind of fire my firewood can make. You are a Hawthorne Ellie. You are the only Hawthorne I have left. A man finishes what he starts. So does a Hawthorne woman. I love you, kiddo. Grandpa. Ellie lowered the letter. Outside, the snow had begun. Real snow, the first of the season, falling thick and slow past the window. The streetlights below caught each flake as it fell and turned them for one brief moment each into something gold. She sat very still in the chair at her grandfather's desk. She did not cry. She thought of Cordelia's laugh. She thought of Bennett's cold, polite smile. She thought of Sterling with his sunglasses indoors. She thought of her grandfather alone in his last years in that big house in Newport, surrounded by people who were already counting his money. And then slowly, very slowly, the corner of her mouth lifted. Not in a smile, in something older than a smile. In the quiet, dangerous expression of a woman who has just understood for the first time exactly what kind of weapon she is holding. She reached out and laid her hand flat on the cover of the ledger. "Okay, Grandpa," she said softly to the empty room. "Okay." The snow kept falling. The radiator hissed. The desk, 150 years old and finally awake, sat in the corner of a small apartment in Somerville and waited to see what she would do next. The night did not pass in any way she would later be able to describe. There was no clock for it. There was no rhythm. There was only the desk and the ledger and the small yellow lamp she had clicked on at some point and then forgotten, and the cup of coffee she had poured, and then never drunk, the surface of it gone cold and dull while she turned the pages. She read straight through. She read the way a soldier reads a battlefield map. She read the way a doctor reads a chart. She read with the slow, dawning, terrible attention of a person who is realizing paragraph by paragraph that the world she has been living in is not the world she thought it was. Her grandfather's handwriting filled every page, neat, patient, architectural. The same hand that had written her birthday cards, the same hand that had labeled the small jars of brass screws in his workshop, the same hand that had signed the back of every photograph in his albums in pencil, in case the photograph ever needed to find its way home. That hand had been keeping a different kind of record for 32 years. It started in 1978, the year his son Bennett joined the family company. The first entry was small, almost nothing. A note in the margin of a payroll page, a figure that did not match the figure on the corresponding bank statement, a discrepancy of $2,400. Beside it in pencil, her grandfather had written one word: Bennett. Just the name. She turned the page. The discrepancies grew, slowly at first, the way a hairline crack grows in a foundation. 2,000, 5,000, 12,000. A pattern began to emerge. Money that left the company on Friday afternoons through suppliers no one had heard of. Money that entered shell accounts in jurisdictions that did not return phone calls. Routing numbers her grandfather had tracked down himself, copied out by hand, listed in a column of evidence so quiet and methodical, it almost broke her heart. He had known. He had always known. She turned another page, and then she found it. October 14th, 2014. The amount was $2.4 million. The destination was a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Argus Holdings. The sole beneficiary of Argus Holdings, listed in a notation in her grandfather's hand below the entry, was Bennett James Hawthorne. The funds had been routed through 3 intermediary accounts before landing. Her grandfather had tracked every single one. Routing numbers, SWIFT codes, wire times, confirmation codes, the signature of the bank officer who had stamped the outbound transfer. He had even kept a photocopy of the wire authorization slipped between the pages of the ledger like a pressed flower. $2.4 million, pulled out of the Hawthorne Corp Employee Pension Fund, disguised as a payment for consulting services that had never been rendered to a company that had never existed, to enrich one man. Ellie read it 3 times, to make sure her eyes were not lying to her. Her uncle had stolen from his own employees. He had stolen from the people who had worked the floor of the warehouse for 30 years. He had stolen from the women who had answered his father's phones. He had stolen from the men who had broken their backs loading and unloading his trucks. He had taken their retirement money and bought himself a beach house in Anguilla with it. The deed for that beach house, dated 6 months later, was tucked in the next page. She turned the page. She kept reading. The ledger did not stop with Bennett. March 2nd, 2019. Cordelia Hawthorne Pierce had walked into a small notary's office in Tribeca on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after her 60th birthday. She had presented herself as the authorized signatory for the Hawthorne Family Commercial Trust. She had presented a power of attorney document bearing the signature of her father, Walter James Hawthorne. She had used that power of attorney to leverage 4 commercial properties in Manhattan, properties owned by the Hawthorne estate as collateral for a personal line of credit in the amount of $6 million. She had used that line of credit to buy a small art gallery in Chelsea, which she had then quietly run into the ground. She had also used it to pay off the gambling debts of her son Sterling 3 times. The signature on the power of attorney was not her father's. The signature was a forgery. The notary who had stamped it had been paid $3,000 in cash in an envelope in the back booth of a bar on Hudson Street. Her grandfather had tracked the bartender. He had tracked the booth. He had tracked the date. He had photographs. He had paid a private investigator. He had a copy of the original bartender's witness statement, signed and dated. It was tucked between the pages of the ledger like a second pressed flower. Ellie set the ledger down on the desk. She pressed both hands flat against the leather cover. She stared at the wall of her small apartment, at the faded poster of a Vermeer painting she had bought for $9 at a museum gift shop her senior year of college. And she thought about Cordelia's laugh, the Chanel suit, the diamond brooch, the way her aunt had said the word sweetheart, the way she had said the words sad little library with that dripping, syrupy pity. She thought about the women in the Hawthorne Court warehouse, the women whose pensions had bought her aunt a gallery in Chelsea. She thought about her grandfather alone in his study year after year opening this ledger and writing down what they had done and choosing not to turn them in and carrying that weight by himself and never once letting it bend his back. Outside, the snow had stopped. A pale, flat, pre-dawn light was starting to creep into the apartment. She kept reading. The flashback came without warning, the way the worst memories do. She was 22 years old. It was the spring of 2019. She had been a senior at Boston University 3 weeks from graduation. Her thesis on 19th century American printing presses sitting half-finished on her dorm room desk. And then her grandfather had called her on a Tuesday afternoon, and his voice on the phone had sounded smaller than she had ever heard it sound. And he had said very quietly, "Kiddo, I need you to come up to court on Thursday." She had taken the train to Suffolk County Probate. The hearing had been in a small wood-paneled courtroom on the 3rd floor. A judge with white hair and a tired face. A court reporter in a beige cardigan. Bennett's lawyers in a row at one table, 3 of them in dark suits. Bennett himself sitting behind them, his fingers steepled his expression. Patient. Across the aisle alone sat her grandfather, 85 years old that spring. He was wearing a gray suit she had not seen him wear since her grandmother's funeral. His hair was combed back. His hands were folded on the table in front of him. He looked very small. He looked very tired. But when he looked up and saw Ellie come in, his face had done a thing she would never forget. It had lifted just for a second the way the face of a drowning man lifts when he sees the rope. Bennett's argument was simple. He had filed a petition to have his father declared mentally incompetent. He wanted to be made conservator of the Hawthorne estate. He wanted control of the family company. He had 3 doctors lined up to testify that Walter Hawthorne was suffering from progressive cognitive decline. He had a financial advisor ready to testify that Walter had been making erratic decisions. He had photographs. He had memos. He had a stack of papers 6 inches thick. Walter had no lawyer. He had only his granddaughter. Ellie had taken the stand. She had been 22 years old. She had never been in a courtroom in her life. Her hands had been shaking so badly, she had had to fold them in her lap. The opposing counsel had been a man in his 40s with a gold watch and a smooth voice. He had asked her a series of polite, mocking questions. How often did she actually see her grandfather? What did she really know about his daily activities? Was she aware that he had been forgetting names? Was she aware that he had been losing weight? Was she aware that he was approaching 90 years of age and that decline was quite simply a fact of biology? She had let him finish, and then she had spoken. She had told the court quietly that her grandfather had been working for the past 4 months on the restoration of a Hamilton wristwatch. A 1953 Hamilton, the exact watch her father had worn. Her father, who had died of a sudden heart attack when Ellie was 11, leaving her with no living parent and only one grandfather to raise her. She had described the watch in detail, the case, the crown, the movement, The precise, painstaking work her grandfather had done that spring replacing the balance staff. She had described the tools he had used. She had described the specific movement her grandfather had identified by sight on the very first afternoon a Hamilton caliber 747, manufactured in 1953, with a known weakness in its mainspring barrel. She had described the small jeweler's loop he wore on a chain around his neck, the way he held the watch in his palm like a small bird when he showed her the work he had done that day. She had described the moment 2 weeks earlier when he had handed the finished watch to her on her birthday and had said, "Ellie, your dad would have wanted you to have this." She had not cried while she said it. She had looked the lawyer in the eye. And then she had turned to the judge and she had said, "Your Honor, my grandfather is the most clear-eyed man I have ever known. He remembers things from 1953 with more accuracy than most people remember their own phone numbers. He is not in decline. He is being hunted." The judge had ruled in Walter's favor inside of an hour. Bennett had walked out of the courtroom with his face the color of a stone wall. And in the hallway outside, in the cold marble silence of the third floor of the courthouse, her grandfather had stopped and turned to her, and he had put one hand on the back of her neck, the way he had when she was small, and he had pulled her gently against his chest, and he had said in a voice she would carry with her the rest of her life, "They never stop coming, kiddo." But neither do we. Ellie sat at the desk in the gray pre-dawn light of her apartment in Somerville and remembered her grandfather's hand on the back of her neck. The ledger lay open in front of her. The accusation against Cordelia in his patient handwriting. The accusation against Bennett dated, sourced, witnessed. He had been gathering this evidence the entire time, while she had been on the witness stand defending him, while he had been losing the war for his own dignity in a small wood-paneled courtroom. He had been quietly, methodically in the early mornings of his Newport study building the case that would outlive him. She closed the ledger, gently, like closing the cover on a sleeping animal. It was 4 in the morning. The apartment was very still. She stood up. Her legs ached from sitting. She walked to the kitchen window. She looked out over the rooftops of Somerville. The streetlights had gone the dim orange of the hour just before dawn. Somewhere across the city, a delivery truck was starting its rounds. Somewhere, a man was waking up to go to work. She stood at the window for a long time, and then very slowly the doubt began. She had not expected it. She had thought in the warm rush of reading the letter that her course was already chosen, that she would walk into Atticus Sullivan's office on Monday morning and bring her family down, that the path was clear. It was not clear. She thought about it. She made herself think about it honestly. She could burn the ledger. She could burn it tonight. There was a fireplace 2 floors below her in the apartment of her landlady, an old woman who would let her use it for the asking. She could take the ledger downstairs at 5 in the morning. She could lay it on the grate. She could strike a match. She could watch 32 years of careful documentation curl into ash. She could take the gold and the Geneva key and the $42 million, and she could disappear. There were quiet places in Maine, a small town on the coast, a bookshop with apartments above it. She had passed it once on a college trip to Acadia. She had stood in front of it and thought for a brief moment about a different kind of life. She could buy that bookshop. She could buy the building it was in. She could buy the whole town if she wanted to. She could change her name. She could go to her grandfather's grave in Mount Auburn Cemetery once a year and bring him cherry pipe tobacco and never speak to another Hawthorne again. It would be easy. It would be safe. It would let her live the next 60 years without ever again stepping into a room with Cordelia Hawthorne Pierce, or Bennett Hawthorne, or Sterling Pierce, without ever again hearing Cordelia laugh, without ever again feeling the cold, polite weight of her uncle's eyes. She thought about it for a long time. She thought about it standing at the kitchen window. She thought about it sitting back down at the desk. She thought about it lying flat on her back on the rug, staring at the water stain on her ceiling. She thought about her father. Her father had been 41 years old when he died. Heart attack. Sudden, they had said. Ellie had been 11 years old. She remembered the morning of the funeral. Her grandfather had come up to the house in his old gray suit, and he had knelt down in front of her in the hallway, and he had taken both of her hands in his weathered ones, and he had said, "Kiddo, I am here. As long as I am alive, you are not alone in this world. Do you understand?" And she had nodded, and he had been telling the truth. For the next 15 years, he had been telling the truth. She thought about what her grandfather had carried in the last 3 years of her father's life. Bennett had been shutting his older brother out of the company for years by then. Her father had been the gentler of Walter's 2 sons. He had not been built for warfare. The pressure of a slow, deliberate family internal exile had been very heavy on a quiet man who had only ever wanted to do his job and come home and read to his daughter at bedtime. It had probably not killed him. Hearts fail for 100 reasons. But she had wondered more than once in the years since whether Bennett's patient cruelty had not at least helped speed the process along. She thought about her grandfather sitting alone in his study at midnight, year after year, opening the same ledger, writing down what had been done to one of his sons by the other. And then, slowly, she reached for her phone. It was 4:30 in the morning. She did not expect anyone to answer, but the line picked up on the second ring. Eleanor. Atticus Sullivan's voice was clear. He had not been asleep. She did not ask why a 72-year-old lawyer was awake at 4:30 in the morning. She suspected she knew. "Atticus, I'm sorry to call this early." "Don't be." She hesitated. "Atticus, if I burn the ledger, if I take the money and disappear, will my grandfather be disappointed in me?" There was a long pause on the line. She could hear very faintly the sound of a clock ticking on his side of the phone. A grandfather clock, she thought. Of course. He would have one. "Eleanor," he said finally, "your grandfather did not give you that ledger to make you do anything. He gave it to you because he trusted your judgment. He told me the last time I saw him that you were the only person in his life who had never asked him for anything. He said that meant you were the only person whose hands he could put it in." She closed her eyes. He never chose wrong, kiddo. Not in 89 years. Not once. The word kiddo. He had used the word kiddo. He had never called her that before. She understood now that he and her grandfather had been closer than she had known. That this old lawyer, this quiet man with his folder and his patient voice, had been mourning Walter Hawthorne in his own way for 3 weeks. That he had been waiting perhaps for this phone call. "Thank you, Atticus. Whatever you decide, I'm here." He hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time. Then she stood up. She walked to the desk. She placed her palm on the cover of the ledger. She thought about her grandfather's hand on the back of her neck in the courthouse hallway. She thought about the women in the warehouse whose pensions had been turned into a beach house in Anguilla. She thought about her own father, dead at 41. She thought about her grandfather alone at his desk for 32 years. A man finishes what he starts. So does a Hawthorne woman. She opened the ledger. Outside, the sun was just beginning to come up over the rooftops of Somerville. A thin, cold, clean light. The kind of light that does not flatter anyone. She picked up a pen. She began to make notes. By 8 in the morning, she had a list. By 10, she had a plan. By noon, she was in Atticus Sullivan's office. She was carrying the ledger in a canvas bag at her side. Sullivan rose when she walked in. He did not say anything. He simply gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. She placed the canvas bag on the floor between her feet. "I'd like to know everything," she said. He nodded, as if he had been expecting this exact sentence. "All right." He went to a filing cabinet behind his desk. He unlocked the bottom drawer. He pulled out a thick manila folder sealed with red tape. He laid it on the desk between them. "This was delivered to me by your grandfather 3 weeks before he died. He gave me very specific instructions. I was not to open it unless you asked." He cut the tape. He opened the folder. What he showed her over the next 45 minutes would have made a lesser woman lightheaded. 3 weeks before his death, Walter Hawthorne had not just kept his ledger. He had acted on it. He had hired a former federal prosecutor, a woman in her 60s who had spent 20 years at the Department of Justice. He had paid her a quiet retainer. She had reviewed every page of the ledger. She had verified every entry. She had then, at his direction, prepared 3 sealed packets of evidence, notarized copies of the ledger pages, sworn statements from witnesses Walter had interviewed personally, bank records that had been obtained through legal subpoena via a parallel civil proceeding. 3 weeks before he died, those 3 sealed packets had been delivered by certified courier to 3 addresses. The first address was the Internal Revenue Service field office on Stewart Street in Boston, marked for the attention of the lead criminal investigator for tax fraud in the New England district. The second address was the Securities and Exchange Commission Regional Office, Boston. The third address was a holding vault at the law firm of Sullivan and Associates, with instructions that it be transferred to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the event of any harm coming to Eleanor Hawthorne. Ellie stared at Atticus. Atticus stared back. "He sent it 3 weeks before he died," she said softly. 3 weeks. "Yes. So the IRS already has this." "They have had it for nearly 2 months, Eleanor. They are simply being patient." Patient. They wanted the will to be read first. They wanted Bennett and Cordelia to publicly accept the inheritance. They wanted to see them take possession of the assets. Tax fraud cases are easier to prosecute, my dear, when the defendants have publicly claimed the assets in question. She let that sit. The will had been read 4 days ago. Cordelia had taken the keys to Newport. Bennett had given his Vanguard account number to the lawyers who would administer the transfer. Sterling had walked into the secondary garage and run his hand along the hood of the 1967 Shelby. They had each in those 4 days formally claimed and accepted assets that the federal government already had documented evidence had been purchased in part with proceeds of fraud. The trap had not been set the day Ellie inherited the desk. The trap had been set 5 years ago. The desk had simply been the key to the door of the cell they were already standing in. Ellie sat back in her chair. She let out a long, slow breath. She thought for one helpless moment about her grandfather, about his quiet face in the doorway of his workshop, about the way he had said every time she came to visit, "There's my girl. There's my girl." About the patience in the way he sanded a piece of wood layer by layer with progressively finer paper until the surface gleamed like still water. He had built this trap the same way, sanded it layer by layer for 5 years, so smooth at the end that they had not seen it. She lifted her eyes to Atticus. "Then what does he need me for?" Atticus folded his hands on the desk. "He needs you, Eleanor, because the federal government can take their money. The federal government can put them in prison, but the federal government cannot take from them the one thing he wanted them to lose, which is..." Atticus's eyes were very steady. "The company Eleanor, Hawthorne Corp., 91 years old, founded by your great-grandfather, built by your grandfather. The thing they spent their whole lives trying to take from him. the thing he could not stand to see them have even for an hour after he was gone. She understood. He wants me to take it from them. Before the IRS freezes the rest of their assets, before they go to prison, before they have any leverage left at all. Yes. She nodded slowly. She did not feel afraid. She felt clean. That afternoon, when she got back to her apartment in Somerville, two things had changed. The first was that the front door of her apartment was not locked. She stopped in the hallway. She had locked it that morning. She always locked it. She had been a woman living alone in a city for 4 years. She had not once forgotten. She pushed the door open slowly with her foot. Inside, nothing was obviously wrong. Nothing had been broken. Nothing had been taken. Her television was still on its stand. Her purse, which she had left on the kitchen counter, was untouched. But her drawers had been opened. All of them. Carefully. The kitchen drawers. The bedroom drawers. The drawers in the small chest in the hall. And the desk. The bottom right drawer of the Davenport had been pulled fully out and set on the floor beside the desk. The carved back panel had been examined. There were faint scratches in the brass handle, the kind you make when you try to pry something open with the wrong tool. The hidden compartment had not been triggered because they had not known what they were looking for. But they had known they were looking for something. The ledger and the gold were not in the apartment. She had taken them with her that morning in the canvas bag, the first thing she had done at first light. She had moved them to a safe deposit box at a small bank in Cambridge before she had gone to see Atticus. Whoever had been here had found nothing. She stood in the doorway of her own apartment for a long minute. She did not cry. She did not call the police. She walked to her bedroom. She took out a small overnight bag. She packed quickly. Underwear, socks, a pair of jeans, a sweater, her toothbrush, the small leather notebook that had belonged to her father, which she kept on her nightstand. She zipped the bag. The second thing that had changed was her phone. It had been ringing as she walked through the door, but she had silenced it. Now, as she sat on the edge of her bed, she picked it up and looked. 3 missed calls, all from a number she did not recognize, a Boston area code. The third call had left a voicemail. She pressed play. The voice was Bennett's. It was very smooth, very calm. The voice of a man who has lived his whole life knowing he can buy his way out of any room. Eleanor, I hope you're well. I think we should speak. I think you've come into possession of something that doesn't belong to you. And I think you'll find that I am a far more reasonable man than the people you would otherwise have to deal with. There are elegant ways to handle a thing like this, sweetheart. And there are inelegant ways. I prefer the elegant route if you would. I'm sure we can come to an understanding. Call me back at this number within 48 hours. After that, well, after that, I'm afraid the situation tends to make its own decisions. The recording ended. Ellie sat very still on the edge of her bed. Then she stood up. She went to the kitchen. She took her phone, opened the back, and pulled the SIM card out. She set the SIM card on the counter. She picked up a pair of kitchen scissors. She cut the SIM card in half. She carried her overnight bag to the door. She picked up the canvas tote with the ledger that she had retrieved from the bank on the way home. She put on her father's coat. She turned out the light. She did not look back at the apartment. She caught a cab at the corner. She rode it across the river into the city. She had the driver take her to the Liberty Hotel on Charles Street. The old Charles Street jail converted now into one of the most expensive places to sleep in Boston. She paid in cash. She gave a name that was not her own. The young man at the front desk did not ask any questions. The Liberty did not ask questions. That was part of why she had chosen it. She rode the elevator up to the 8th floor. She let herself into a small, elegant room with a view of the Charles River. She set her bag on the bed. She stood at the window for a long time, watching the lights of Cambridge across the water. She thought for the first time about the size of what was happening to her. It was a strange thing. She did not think about it in fear. She thought about it in measurement. She thought about it the way a carpenter measures a board before cutting. There was a job in front of her now. She would need certain tools. She would need to acquire them quickly. She would need to use them well. She picked up the hotel phone. She dialed Atticus's office. She left a message with his answering service. Tell him I've had to relocate. Tell him I'll be at this number for the next 72 hours. Tell him I need every Massachusetts statute on corporate share transfer. And tell him I need a meeting with my aunt and my uncle on Tuesday morning, 10 a.m., his office. Tell him to make it sound serious. She hung up. She unpacked her bag. The 72 hours that followed were the most concentrated 3 days of her life. She did not leave the room except for 2 errands. The first, on the morning of the second day, was to a small tailor's shop on Newbury Street. She bought a single navy blue blazer off the rack and had it taken in at the waist. The seamstress, an older woman with steel gray hair and very fast hands, did the work while Ellie waited. The blazer cost $340. Ellie paid in cash. When she put it on in the small mirror at the back of the shop, she did not recognize the woman who looked back at her. The second errand on the morning of the third day was to a small barber shop near the State House. She had her hair cut, not dramatically, just to the shoulders. Clean, sharp. The barber, an older man with a mustache, asked her if she was sure. She told him she was sure. He cut. When he was done, he held up a hand mirror behind her so she could see the back. She nodded. She tipped him well. The rest of the time she worked. Atticus had a courier deliver 3 boxes to the hotel. Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 156. D. The Business Corporation Act. The bylaws of Hawthorne Corporation. 40 years of board minutes. Old proxy statements. Old voting records. The shareholder agreement her grandfather had drafted in 1996, and that had governed the family ownership of the company ever since. She read all of it. She read it the way she had read every book of her childhood. The way her grandfather had taught her to read, a habit he had drilled into her since she was small, slowly, with a pencil, underlining what mattered, writing in the margins, flipping back to compare. She made notes. She made lists. She made flowcharts on hotel stationery. She used the desk in the room until she ran out of surface, and then she used the floor. She began to understand the shape of what her grandfather had done. Bennett did not in fact control Hawthorne Corp. He had thought he did for almost 20 years. The voting structure of the company on paper gave him a controlling block of 45%. Cordelia held 20%. Sterling held 5%. The remaining 30 had until 3 weeks ago been held by Walter Hawthorne himself in a private trust. That trust, Ellie realized, had quietly transferred at the moment of Walter's death. It had not gone to Bennett. It had not gone to Cordelia. It had gone to her. It had been buried in the will. It had not been read aloud. It had been listed only as the Davenport writing desk located in the corner of my study, because the deed of trust, the actual legal instrument of the transfer, was inside the desk, inside the same hidden compartment as the ledger and the gold and the letter. She had not even noticed it at first. It had been folded inside the manila envelope behind the letter. A single sheet of legal-size paper. She had thought it was part of the letter. It was not. It was a notarized assignment, signed and sealed. She held 30% of Hawthorne Corp. She did not by herself hold control. Bennett still held more than she did, but 30% was enough to do something else. 30% was enough under Massachusetts corporate law to call a special meeting of the board, to force a vote on the transfer of additional shares, to create at minimum a nuisance that could not be ignored. Combined with the ledger, it was enough to do considerably more than that. She began to draft the documents. By the morning of the third day, she had what she needed. She stood in the bathroom of the hotel room. The fluorescent light was harsh and cold above the sink. She placed her hands on either side of the basin. She looked at her own face in the mirror. She did not look like a librarian. She looked like a woman who had been preparing for something her entire life without knowing it. Her hair was clean and short. Her face was tired but settled. The borrowed coat was hanging on the back of the door. The navy blazer was on a hanger by the closet. The white blouse and dark trousers hung beside it, pressed and ready. Her grandfather's leather notebook lay on the nightstand by the bed. She took a long breath. "Got it, Grandpa," she said softly. Her phone rang. The new prepaid one she had bought at a corner store yesterday afternoon. Only 2 people had the number. One was Atticus. The other was the manager at the safe deposit bank in Cambridge. It was Atticus. Eleanor. Atticus. They've agreed to the meeting. Tuesday morning, 10 a.m. My office. All 3 of them. Bennett brought up his own counsel. A man named Garrett Kessler out of New York. Fairly aggressive. I've heard of him. Good. Cordelia is bringing a handbag, but I don't think she's bringing a lawyer. Sterling will likely just be there. Good. There was a pause on the line. The clock ticking again on his end. A gentle, steady rhythm. Eleanor, are you ready? She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her did not blink. Yes, she said. All right then. He hung up. She stood at the sink for a long moment. Outside the hotel window, the early winter sun was coming up over the city of Boston, and the windows of the Charles Street buildings were catching the light, one by one in flashes of cold gold. She would not be the woman who had walked into that lawyer's office 4 days ago. That woman had buried her grandfather and had lost. That woman had walked out of a conference room with the laughter of vultures behind her. The woman who would walk back into Atticus Sullivan's office on Tuesday morning would not be that woman. She would be the woman Walter Hawthorne had been building quietly, patiently, for 26 years. A man finishes what he starts. So does a Hawthorne woman. She turned off the bathroom light. She had a meeting to prepare for. Tuesday morning came in cold and clear. The storm had moved off the coast overnight, and the sky over Boston was the kind of pale, washed blue that only happens in early winter when the air has been emptied of everything except light. Ellie stood at the window of her hotel room on the 8th floor of the Liberty and watched the sun climb up the side of the State House dome. She had been awake since 4. She had not been nervous. She had simply been ready, and being ready, she had discovered, was a kind of stillness that did not allow for sleep. She had drunk coffee. She had reviewed her notes one final time. She had laid out the navy blazer and a white blouse and a pair of dark trousers on the chair by the bed. She had polished her shoes herself with a small kit she had bought at a drugstore. Her grandfather had taught her how to polish shoes when she was 9. He had said, "The way you take care of small things tells the world what you would do with large ones." She put on the blazer. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, and was also in some way she could not entirely name the truest version of herself she had ever seen. She picked up the canvas bag that held a ledger. She left the hotel. She did not take a cab. She walked. The walk from the Liberty to Atticus Sullivan's office in the financial district was a little under a mile. She walked it slowly, down Charles Street past the small shops just opening their doors, across the common where a thin frost still lay on the grass, where the morning sun had not yet reached, down through downtown crossing where the city was beginning to wake. She walked with her hands in the pockets of her father's coat and the canvas bag over her shoulder. She did not hurry. She had thought the night before about what her grandfather would have done before a meeting like this, and she had concluded that he would have walked slowly alone and let his thoughts settle, the way snow settles on a field overnight. She arrived at the building at 9:45. She rode the elevator up to the 32nd floor in silence. She walked into Atticus Sullivan's reception area, and the receptionist, a woman in her 50s, who had clearly been briefed, simply nodded at her and pressed a button on her desk. "Mr. Sullivan is ready for you, Miss Hawthorne." "Thank you." She walked past the reception desk and into the long hallway that led to the conference room. The room had not changed. The same long mahogany table, the same wall of glass, the same pale gray carpet, the same view of the city, except this morning the city was bright instead of rain-soaked, and the light coming through the window fell on the table in long, clean rectangles. Ellie took the seat at the head of the table, the seat where her grandfather had sat years ago every time he had come up to this office. She set the canvas bag on the chair beside her. She removed the ledger from the bag. She placed it on the table in front of her, square in the center, parallel to the edge. She folded her hands on top of it. She waited. Atticus came in 2 minutes later. He sat down on her right. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply set a slim leather portfolio on the table in front of him and folded his own hands and waited with her the way he had waited with her grandfather, year after year in this same room. At 10 o'clock exactly, the door opened. Cordelia came in first. She came in like weather. The sharp click of her heels, the whisper of expensive fabric, the cloud of Hermes perfume, expensive and assertive, walking 3 steps ahead of her and announcing her like a herald. She was wearing a cream-colored coat and a pearl choker, and she was already speaking before she had crossed the threshold. "Atticus, I want it on the record that this is harassment. I have already accepted the terms of the will. My brother and I have already moved on with our lives. If this little exercise is some kind of last-minute attempt to renegotiate, I'll have my attorneys file before lunch." She stopped in the doorway. She had not seen Ellie at the head of the table. She saw her now. The pearls at her throat seemed to draw very slightly tighter against her neck. Her eyes did a small, swift inventory. The blazer, the hair, the posture, the seat above all. Cordelia had been a Hawthorne her entire life. She knew which seat at this table had been her father's. Bennett came in a step behind her. He did not stop in the doorway. He did not react visibly. He simply took in the room with one slow, careful glance, the way a man takes stock of a room he has just decided he will need to be careful in. Then he stepped inside and held the door for the man behind him. That man was Garrett Kessler. Kessler was 40-something, tall fit in a charcoal suit that cost more than Ellie's monthly rent. He had the smooth, attentive look of a litigator who has been told this would be a routine meeting and is already in his first 3 seconds in the room beginning to revise that assumption. He was carrying a slim brown briefcase. He set it down on the table without looking at where he was setting it. His eyes were on Ellie. Sterling came in last. Sterling was wearing sunglasses, indoors, again. He flopped into a chair near the foot of the table without looking at anyone, pulled out his phone, and began to scroll. Atticus gestured politely. "Please, sit down." Cordelia sat. She sat very carefully, as a person sits when she is no longer entirely sure of the floor beneath her chair. Bennett took the chair opposite Atticus. Kessler sat on Bennett's left, opening his briefcase, removing a single yellow legal pad. Ellie did not speak. She let the silence stretch. Cordelia was the first to break. "Well," her voice was sharper than she meant it to be. She tried to soften it. "Eleanor, you're looking well. You did something with your hair." Ellie did not reply. She lifted her right hand and placed it slowly on the cover of the ledger. The room understood that gesture before anyone said a word. It was the gesture of a person resting her hand on a weapon. Bennett's eyes followed her hand. He saw the ledger. He had not seen the ledger before except in his own mind, in the dark place where he had been imagining it for the last 6 days. But he recognized it now. He recognized it the way a thief recognizes the shape of a vault he has spent years trying to crack, and has just discovered on a Tuesday morning in a Boston law office has been sitting on a desk all along. His face did not move, but the muscle along his jaw tightened. Ellie spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not speak quickly. She spoke the way her grandfather had spoken when he had something important to say, as if every word had been carried to her from a long way off and deserved to be set down carefully. "Thank you for coming." She let that sit. "I asked Atticus to bring you here today because I have something to discuss with the three of you. It will not take long. When we are finished, you will sign certain documents. After you sign them, you will leave. We will not speak again." Cordelia laughed. It was a brittle thing. "Eleanor, sweetheart, I don't know what fantasy you have been entertaining in that little apartment of yours, but you are in no position to make demands of anyone. We accepted the terms of the will. We humored your grandfather's last cruel little joke. You inherited a piece of furniture. Now, if you have decided that wasn't enough for you, I'm afraid you will need to file in probate court like everybody else." Ellie looked at her aunt for a long moment. Then she opened the ledger. She did not turn pages randomly. She had, in 3 days at the Liberty, marked the pages she wanted with small slips of yellow paper. She turned to the first one. She did not read aloud. She simply turned the ledger so that Bennett could see it. She slid it 3 inches across the table toward him. She placed her index finger on a single line. October 14th, 2014. $2.4 million. Routed through First Atlantic to Cayman National. Routing number 026009593. Destination account. Argus Holdings sole beneficiary Bennett James Hawthorne. The wire authorization on the next page bears your signature, Bennett. The counter signature belongs to a vice president at the bank who my grandfather's investigator confirmed was paid $8,000 in cash to expedite the transfer. She let her finger rest on the line. Bennett did not look at the ledger. He looked at her. His face, for the first time since she had known him, did something interesting. It did not become afraid. He was too disciplined for that. But the quality of his stillness changed. The stillness became the stillness of a man calculating distances. The stillness of a fox at the edge of a clearing listening for a hound. Beside him, Garrett Kessler's pen had stopped on his legal pad. Ellie turned a page. March 2nd, 2019. A power of attorney presented to Maddox and Reed Notaries, Public Tribeca, New York. Used to leverage 4 commercial properties in Midtown Manhattan as collateral for a personal line of credit. $6 million. She turned the ledger again. She slid it now toward Cordelia. The signature on the power of attorney is not your father's, Cordelia. The notary who stamped it accepted $3,000 in cash in an envelope in the back booth of a bar on Hudson Street. My grandfather hired a private investigator. He has the bartender's witness statement. He has photographs. They are all in this ledger. Cordelia's hand had risen halfway to her mouth and then frozen there. The pearls at her throat rose and fell with one quick breath. Her eyes flicked to Bennett. They held there. Then they flicked back to Ellie. This is preposterous. It was a weak word. She knew it as soon as she said it. Garrett Kessler closed his legal pad. He did not look up. He simply quietly, in one smooth motion, snapped the clasp of his briefcase shut. He stood up. Mr. Hawthorne, I am going to need to have a word with you in the hallway, outside the presence of opposing counsel. Now, please. Sit down, Garrett. Bennett did not look at him. His eyes were still on Ellie. His voice was very even. Mr. Hawthorne, with respect, I cannot represent you in matters of federal financial fraud under the terms of the engagement letter you signed with my firm. That kind of representation requires a separate retainer and a separate authorization from our managing partner. If we are now in those waters, I have to formally withdraw. I said, sit down. I am sorry, Bennett. Garrett Kessler picked up his briefcase. He nodded politely to Atticus. He nodded politely, almost reverentially, to Ellie. He did not nod to Bennett. He walked out of the room. The door clicked softly shut behind him. The silence he left was different from the silence before. It was the silence of a fortress that has just lost its drawbridge. Cordelia made a small sound. It was not a word. It was the kind of sound a person makes who has run out of the language she has spent her whole life relying on. Ellie went on. I was not finished. She turned 3 more pages. She did not slide the ledger this time. She simply read the entries one after the other in a quiet, even voice. She read the dates. She read the amounts. She read the names of the shell corporations. She read the accounts in Anguilla and the accounts in Liechtenstein, and the small holding company in Delaware that had been used to launder $140,000 in Sterling's gambling debts in the spring of 2021. Sterling looked up from his phone for the first time when his name was spoken. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The color simply left his face in a single soft motion, like a window blind being lowered. Ellie closed the ledger. She placed her hand back on top of it. She looked at Bennett. Now, here is where we are. Bennett very slowly recovered. He had been raised to this. He had spent 40 years in rooms like this one. He had been on the wrong side of a table before. He had clawed his way back. He took a long, controlled breath. And when he spoke, his voice had the easy authority of a man who has not yet conceded anything. Eleanor, let's be calm. I am calm. That book proves nothing. It proves everything. It is the diary of a senile old man with a grudge against his children. The signatures could be forged. The investigator could have been bribed by him to lie. The notary could be discredited. Every line of it is challengeable in court. We could spend 10 years in litigation, and you would not see $1 of recovery. Even if any of this were true, you, my dear, are a librarian. You do not have the resources to fight a federal case. He smiled. It was a thin, careful thing. Then Bennett did something unexpected. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit. He took out his phone. He set it on the table screen up. He swiped through it for a moment, and then he turned it so that Ellie could see. I had someone look into you, Eleanor. After the will reading. A precaution. You understand. She did not move. An overdue library notice from August. A volume of Wharton, $200 on the replacement schedule. A parking citation on Mass Avenue from October, $60 never paid. A small balance on your credit card from last spring that went to a collections notice for 11 days before you cleared it. His voice had recovered some of its old smoothness. These are not the credentials of a woman who can be trusted to manage a 91-year-old company, sweetheart. A federal court would notice. A board would notice. The press, if it came to that, would certainly notice. Ellie listened to him finish. Then, very calmly, she opened a small folder she had set beside the ledger when she sat down. She had not touched it until now. She withdrew 3 pieces of paper and slid them one by one across the table. The first was the library system's confirmation that the Wharton volume had been returned undamaged on the 11th of November. The second was a paid receipt for the parking ticket dated the same week. The third was a printed statement from her credit card with a 0 balance dated the morning before this meeting. I clear my own debts, Bennett. Quickly, quietly, by myself. It is one of several differences between us. She let her hand rest again on the ledger. Anything else? Bennett did not answer. The smile on his face had finally gone. Then I am willing to be reasonable, he said after a moment. He recovered. He always recovered. $5 million, Eleanor. Wired to any account you name. By the end of business today. In exchange, you give me that book and you walk away. You go back to your library. You go back to your quiet little life. You forget you ever opened that desk. He let that offer sit on the table. He had used the same tone Ellie thought 1,000 times in his career. The tone of a man who has decided how much something is worth and is simply waiting for the other party to nod. It had probably worked on a great many people. Ellie did not nod. She tilted her head very slightly, and she looked at her uncle as if she were seeing him from a long way off. Bennett. Yes, sweetheart. You are not paying attention. He blinked. Just once. My grandfather was 89 years old. He spent 40 years building Hawthorne Court. He spent the last 5 years of his life preparing for this morning. You did not catch him senile. You caught him patient. There is a difference. You would have understood that if you had ever sat in his workshop for an afternoon. She paused. He did not leave the ledger to me to use as leverage against you. He left it to me as a record. The decision he made about what to do with it, he made 5 years ago. 3 weeks before he died, he had a former federal prosecutor deliver notarized copies of every page in this book to the Internal Revenue Service field office on Stewart Street, to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and to a sealed packet at this firm to be released to the FBI in the event that anything happened to me. The silence that followed was the silence of a building that has just felt the first tremor of an earthquake, somewhere very far away. Bennett's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Cordelia made a small, wet noise. It was the beginning of a sob suppressed. The IRS has had this material for almost 2 months, Bennett. They were waiting for the will to be read. They were waiting for the two of you to publicly accept the inheritance. Tax fraud cases are easier to prosecute when the defendants have publicly claimed the assets. You took the keys to Newport 4 days ago, Cordelia. You signed the transfer paperwork on the Vanguard portfolio yesterday morning, Bennett. You have in the last 4 days done exactly what they were waiting for you to do. She placed her hand flat on the cover of the ledger again. By the close of business tomorrow, every domestic asset connected to the Hawthorne name will be frozen, pending a federal audit and seizure proceeding. The Newport house, the Vanguard portfolio, the vintage cars, the brokerage accounts, the summer place in Anguilla, Bennett that was paid for with the warehouse pension fund. All of it. The $5 million you just offered me to walk away. You don't have it. You haven't had it since Friday. You just don't know it yet. She did not raise her voice while she said any of this. She did not need to. Bennett's hands had begun to tremble. He had set them flat on the table to control them. The trembling was very small, but she could see it. "You set us up." His voice was hoarse. "I did not set you up." She looked at him. "You set yourselves up. The day you decided that the company my grandfather built was not enough for you. The day you decided that the women in your warehouse did not deserve their pensions. The day you decided that your own father was not allowed to choose what to do with his own life. He just made sure that when you finally fell, you would not land on anyone else." She let that sit. Then she did the last thing. She reached into the canvas bag beside her chair. She took out a folder. She opened it. She removed 3 documents. She placed them on the table in front of her. Atticus, beside her, slid them down the polished mahogany toward Bennett and Cordelia and Sterling. 3 identical folders. "You have 2 options today." Her voice was steady. "Option A, you walk out of this office without signing. I make a phone call. The packet at this firm is delivered to the FBI Boston field office by hand before the end of business today. The criminal indictment will be filed before the end of the week. You both face decades in federal prison. Sterling is named as a beneficiary of the gambling debt laundering, which makes him a witness at minimum and a co-conspirator at worst. You will lose Newport. You will lose the cars. You will lose Anguilla. You will lose every dollar in the Vanguard accounts. You will lose your homes. You will lose your liberty." Bennett had gone very white. "Option B, you sign these documents, right now, today, in front of Atticus." She tapped the folder. "You sign over your controlling shares of Hawthorne Corp to me, all of them. Yours, Cordelia. Yours, Bennett. Sterling's 5% as well. You surrender your seats on the board effective immediately. You agree in writing never to set foot inside any Hawthorne Corp facility again. You agree in writing never to communicate with me again. You walk out of here today with the physical assets you inherited under the public will. You take Newport. You take the cars. You take the Vanguard portfolio. And you spend the next several years figuring out how to negotiate with the United States Treasury on those assets on your own with your own attorneys. The IRS will still come. I cannot stop that. But if you sign today, the FBI packet stays sealed in this office. The criminal referral does not happen. You face civil seizure. You do not face prison." She paused. "That is the deal." She placed her hand on the ledger one final time. "This stays with me. As long as you stay away from the company. As long as you do not retaliate against me in any way. As long as you do not contest. The ledger stays in a safe deposit box. If anything happens to me, the box opens automatically. You understand what that means." The room was very quiet. Cordelia was crying. Silently. Her shoulders shook in tiny controlled spasms. The mascara had begun to run in 2 thin lines down her cheeks. She did not lift a hand to stop it. She had perhaps forgotten that she was wearing any. Bennett stared at the ledger. He stared at it for what felt like a very long time. He was, Ellie thought, calculating. He was running through every angle. He was looking for the move that would let him keep his pride and also keep his freedom. He was a man who had spent his whole life solving problems by buying them. And he was discovering slowly in real time that this was a problem money could not buy. She could see in his face the moment he understood it. His shoulders dropped, just half an inch. But she saw it. He picked up the pen. He did not look at her. He signed. The pen scratched across the paper. Once, twice, 3 times. Each signature small and tight. The controlled signature of a man trying not to let his hand betray him. He signed the share transfer. He signed the resignation from the board. He signed the no contact agreement. He pushed the folder across the table toward Cordelia. Cordelia did not move. Cordelia? Bennett's voice was flat. Sign it. I can. You will. Bennett. Sign it. Cordelia picked up the pen. She signed. She signed the way a person signs a hospital release form for someone she loves. With both hands. Trembling. Without looking. She pushed the folder to Sterling. Sterling stared at it for a long time. He had finally, at some point in the last 15 minutes, taken off his sunglasses. His eyes were small and red and very young. He looked for the first time Ellie could remember like a man who had just understood that he was 28 years old and did not know how to do anything. He signed. He signed slowly, with effort, as if the pen were heavier than he had expected. He pushed the folder back toward Atticus. Atticus did not move quickly. He simply gathered the 3 signature pages with care. He stamped each one with a notary seal he kept in a small lacquered box on the side of his desk. He countersigned each one. He laid them in a row on the table. He looked up. Done, he said quietly. Ellie did not smile. She did not feel triumph. She felt instead a kind of clean stillness. The stillness she had felt as a child after her grandfather had taught her how to refinish a piece of furniture. And she had stepped back at the end of an afternoon and seen the wood gleam under the new coat of oil. That kind of stillness. The stillness of a thing finished well. She stood up. She closed the ledger. She returned it to the canvas bag. She slung the bag over her shoulder. She looked at Cordelia. You will not come to my home again. You will not have anyone come to my home again. You will not call me. You will not write to me. If you ever speak my name in public, it will be the last conversation you have as a free woman. Do you understand? Cordelia nodded. She could not speak. She looked at Bennett. You sent 2 men to my apartment last week, Bennett. They opened my drawers. They moved my things. I know you sent them. You will not send anyone again. You will not approach me. You will not approach my building. You will not approach this firm. The packet in this office is conditional. The condition is your behavior. Do you understand? Bennett held her eyes. For one long second, the old hardness flickered back into him. The instinct to fight. The instinct to find the angle, to find the weak point, to come back at her. She saw it. She saw him almost speak. She did not look away. She did not need to. He looked down. Yes, he said. She turned. She walked the length of the conference room to the door. She did not look back. Her shoes did not make noise on the carpet. The door opened easily under her hand. She stepped out into the hallway. Behind her in the conference room, 3 people sat at a very long table. They did not speak. They did not move. They sat the way the survivors of a small natural disaster sit before they have begun to understand what to do next. She rode the elevator down to the lobby. She walked out into the cold. She walked without thinking about where she was going, all the way back across the city. All the way back over the Common, all the way back up Charles Street. All the way back to the Liberty where the doorman recognized her now and held the door for her without asking. She rode the elevator up to the 8th floor. She let herself into her room. She set the canvas bag down on the bed. She sat down in the chair by the window. She looked out at the river. The Charles in winter, slow and gray and patient, moving toward the harbor, under a thin glaze of ice along the banks. She did not cry. She realized, not cried since the day of the will reading. She had not cried over her grandfather's death once in the 3 weeks since the funeral. She had been too busy. There had been too much to do. She let herself now finally in the small empty room above the river, put her face in her hands. She cried for a long time. She cried not because she was sad, although she was sad. She cried because something very heavy had been set down. She cried because somewhere in the city below her, 3 people were getting into separate cars and beginning the long, slow drive into the rest of their lives with much less than they had walked in with. She cried because her grandfather was not here to see it. She cried because in the end, his hand had still been the one that finished the work even from the grave. He had only used hers. She cried because she missed him. Then after a while, she stopped. She washed her face at the sink. She put on her father's coat. She went out into the cold city. She walked to a bookstore on Newbury Street that she had loved as a college student. She bought a single book, a small leather-bound copy of the Aeneid. Her grandfather had read parts of the Aeneid to her when she was 12. He had loved the line about the soldiers carrying their household gods out of the burning city. She had not understood at 12 why a man would weep for a line of poetry. She thought she understood now. The next morning, she took the train out to Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. It was very cold. The cemetery paths had been swept. The old elms stood bare. Patches of snow lay in the hollows under the stones. Walter Hawthorne's grave was on a small hill near the eastern edge. The stone was new. The earth was still slightly raised. A small bronze plaque bore his name and his dates, and one line beneath it, which her grandfather had written himself years ago, and which Ellie had insisted on having engraved exactly as he had written it. He finished what he started. She knelt down in the snow. She set on the grave a small pouch of cherry pipe tobacco, the same brand he had smoked since she was a child. She set it gently against the base of the stone, where the wind would not blow it away. "Hi, Grandpa." The wind moved in the elms. Far off, a church bell rang. She did not know which one. "It's done." She rested one hand flat on the cold granite. "You said a man finishes what he starts. You told me a Hawthorne woman does too. I want you to know I heard you. I heard you the whole time, even when I didn't think I was listening." She stayed for a long while. She told him about the meeting. She told him about the way Cordelia had looked when the laughter went out of her. She told him about Kessler walking out of the room and about the trembling she had seen in Bennett's hands, and about Sterling taking off his sunglasses for the first time in her memory and looking finally like a frightened 28-year-old boy. She told him about the women in the warehouse and about the pension fund and about the way the IRS had been waiting patient and slow, while her grandfather's letter had ripened in her hand. She told him about her father too, about the Hamilton watch, about the morning of the funeral when he had knelt down in the hallway and held her hands. About all of it. She did not need to say any of these things out loud. She believed in the way her grandfather had taught her to believe in such things that he could hear her perfectly well. The wind picked up. The pouch of pipe tobacco rustled against the granite. A pair of cardinals, bright red against the gray morning, flew through the bare branches of the nearest elm. She watched them go. "I miss you," she said finally. She did not need to say anything else. 6 weeks later, she stood in the corner office on the 42nd floor of Hawthorne Tower in downtown Boston. The office had been redone. Bennett's old steel and glass desk had been hauled out by the same crew that had hauled the rest of his furniture out the week before. The cold black leather chairs had been donated to a nonprofit. The chrome shelves had been stripped from the walls. The walls themselves had been repainted a soft, warm white that took the morning sun the way the walls of her grandfather's workshop had taken it. In the center of the office, angled to catch the sun rising over the harbor, stood the Davenport. It had been refinished, carefully, by a craftsman in a small shop in the South End that her grandfather had used for 40 years. The leather inlay had been replaced with New English bridal leather hand-tooled almost the same color as the old. The brass had been polished. The ivy carving on the back panel had been cleaned of 150 years of dust. The hidden compartment still worked. The wedge spring had been oiled by hand. It was as silent as it had been the first time it opened for her. On the desk stood a small, silver-frame black and white photograph. Walter Hawthorne, 20 years old, in uniform. Korea, 1953. A young man with his life ahead of him. The same gray eyes, the same set jaw, the same patient, steady half smile of a man who had already decided even at 20 that he would finish what he started. Beside the photograph stood her grandfather's old jeweler's loop on its short brass chain. Ellie sat at the desk. She opened the top drawer. She took out the day's correspondence. She set it on the leather. She uncapped a pen, the same brand of pen her grandfather had used, and she began to read. The first 6 weeks of her tenure had not been gentle. She had kept her job at the Boston Public Library part-time on weekends because her grandfather had taught her when she was small never to forget the place she had come from. She had moved from her third-floor walk-up in Somerville into a slightly larger apartment in Cambridge, but she had not bought a house. She had not bought a car. She had walked to the office every morning the same way her grandfather had once walked to the office in the same kind of weather, with the same kind of patience. She had begun slowly to learn the names of the people who worked for her. She had begun slowly to learn the names of the women in the warehouse. She had begun slowly to undo one decision at a time the small cruelties Bennett had folded into the company over the course of 20 years. The pension fund had been quietly restored, not from corporate funds, which would have been unwise, from a private contribution made anonymously by a Geneva-based trust, whose existence the company's accountants did not understand and were not encouraged to ask about. The intercom buzzed. It was her assistant, an older woman named Margaret, who had worked at Hawthorne Corp for 31 years and who had cried quietly in her own office on Ellie's first day, for reasons Ellie understood without asking. "Miss Hawthorne, there is an envelope here for you. It came by courier. There's no return address." Ellie looked up. "Bring it in, please." Margaret came in a moment later. She set a single manila envelope on the desk. She did not ask any questions. She simply nodded and stepped back out and pulled the door softly closed behind her. Ellie picked up the envelope. It was heavier than it looked. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single photograph, 8 inches by 10, glossy, recent. It was a photograph of her. It had been taken outside the Geneva Federal Bank on the Quai des Bergs 3 weeks ago, on the afternoon of the only trip she had taken since the meeting in Atticus's office. She had flown out on a Wednesday and back on a Friday. She had seen no one she knew. She had told no one she was going except Atticus. In the photograph, she was walking down the bank's front steps, alone, her father's coat over her arm, because it had been warm in Geneva that day. Behind the photograph, paper-clipped to the back, was a small white card. A single line of handwriting. It was not Walter's handwriting. She knew her grandfather's hand better than her own. This was someone else's. Steady, older, a man's writing. The card said, "Your grandfather had more than one secret. Eleanor, we should talk. An old friend." She held the card for a long time. She did not feel afraid. She felt instead a quiet, deep curiosity. The kind her grandfather had felt, she thought, every time he had sat down with a clock he had never seen before and lifted off the back plate and looked at the works. She set the card on the desk. She placed her hand palm down flat on the cover of her grandfather's old leather notebook, the one she had carried in her lap on the bus to the will reading 3 months ago on the worst gray day of her life. She looked out at the harbor. The light was clean and strong and pale. A single freighter was moving slowly out toward the open sea, low in the water with whatever it was carrying. She thought of her grandfather. She thought of the workshop on Beacon Hill. She thought of the mahogany under the lamp. She thought of the metal in her small palm. She smiled. A small, private, unhurried smile. "All right, Grandpa," she said softly to the empty office. "What did you leave for me this time?" The desk in the corner caught the morning light. The brass on the drawers glowed warm. The ivy on the back panel cast its small, intricate shadow on the polished wood. Above the harbor, a single gull turned in a long, lazy circle, white against the cold blue sky, and the city of Boston went on about its morning. Eleanor Hawthorne picked up the pen her grandfather had taught her to use, and she got back to work.